Have you ever been the punchline of a room full of people? The one everyone stares at, with a mixture of pity and barely concealed disgust. Nora Caroline stood in the center of the grand Sterling Manor, her simple, understated vintage gown a stark contrast to the glittering sea of haute couture and dripping diamonds. The whispers of the elite were like venom, mocking her for daring to attend the season's most exclusive gala entirely alone. But the laughter died in their throats when the heavy oak doors swung open. The famously reclusive Duke of Ashbourne had arrived, and he wasn't looking at the wealthy hostess. He was looking straight at the woman they had just humiliated. The invitation had arrived on heavy cream-colored cardstock, its edges gilded in authentic gold leaf. Nora Caroline stared at it as it lay on the rustic wooden counter of her botanical conservatory, looking as out of place as a diamond tiara in a potting shed. It was an invitation to the Sinclair Charity Gala, the undisputed crown jewel of the city's social season. Eleanor Sinclair, the matriarch of a sprawling real estate empire, hosted it annually. Nora was a 32-year-old botanist who spent her days preserving rare heritage seeds and restoring native flora to the surrounding counties. Her hands were more accustomed to rich soil than champagne flutes. She knew exactly why she had been invited. Eleanor Sinclair's public relations team had recently advised her to diversify her charitable portfolio. Inviting the founder of a struggling, grassroots environmental initiative was a calculated move to make the Sinclair family appear grounded and eco-conscious. It was a token gesture, a box to be checked. For 3 days, the invitation sat on Nora's desk. She had no desire to subject herself to the scrutinizing gaze of the city's upper crust. She knew these people. She had grown up on the periphery of their world, the daughter of a humble estate manager who had worked for one of the city's older, now bankrupt families. She knew the language of their subtle sneers and the razor-sharp edges of their polite conversation. But the conservatory was in desperate need of funding. The roof of the primary greenhouse was failing, and the winter frosts were approaching. If she could secure even one major donor at the gala, her life's work would be saved. So, she decided to go, and she would go alone. Preparing for the event was an exercise in pragmatism. Nora did not have the means to purchase a dress from a Parisian runway. Instead, she went to her grandmother's cedar trunk. From its depths, she pulled a midnight blue silk gown from the late 1950s. It was a masterpiece of classic tailoring, simple, elegant, with a boat neckline and a sweeping skirt that relied on the quality of the fabric, rather than heavy embellishments to make a statement. She spent 2 evenings carefully altering the waist to fit her modern frame. She wore her dark hair swept up in a neat, unpretentious chignon, fastened with a single silver hairpin that had belonged to her mother. For jewelry, she wore pearl stud earrings. No diamonds, no flashy designer labels. The night of the gala was unseasonably cold. Nora drove her practical, 10-year-old sedan up the winding, lantern-lit driveway of Sterling Manor. The contrast between her vehicle and the procession of imported luxury cars ahead of her was almost comical. When she handed her keys to the valet, the young man blinked in momentary confusion before hastily masking it with professional indifference. Nora took a deep breath, smoothing the midnight blue silk of her skirt, and ascended the sweeping marble staircase. The grand foyer of Sterling Manor was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant, fractured light over the attendees. The air was thick with the scent of rare orchids and expensive, musky perfumes. "Name, please," the impeccably dressed attendant at the door asked, not looking up from his leather-bound guest list. "Nora Caroline," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. The attendant's finger trailed down the list, pausing near the very bottom. Yes, Miss Caroline, representing the Regional Flora Conservancy." He handed her a small, subtly color-coded name badge. The color coding was an open secret among this crowd. It silently broadcasted a guest's net worth and social standing. Nora's badge was a pale, matte gray. The guests milling around her wore badges of rich crimson and deep gold. As she stepped into the main ballroom, she felt the immediate physical weight of 100 eyes shifting toward her. It wasn't a grand cinematic hush, but rather a ripple of micro-expressions. Eyebrows arched, lips pursed, high society predators assessing a newcomer who clearly did not belong in their territory. And then she saw Zoe Montgomery. Zoe was a woman whose wealth was only eclipsed by her cruelty. She and Nora had crossed paths years ago when Zoe's father attempted to bulldoze a protected wetland for a luxury golf course, a project Nora had successfully halted. Through relentless legal injunctions and public protesting, Zoe had never forgiven her for the public embarrassment. Zoe was draped in a violently expensive, sequined crimson gown that clung to her like a second skin. She was holding court near a towering ice sculpture, a glass of vintage champagne balanced delicately in her hand. The moment her eyes locked onto Nora, a slow, predatory smile spread across her face. The lion had spotted the lamb, and the lamb, Nora realized with a sinking heart, had walked right into the den without a shield. The first hour of the gala was an exercise in sheer endurance. Nora attempted to mingle, armed with a polite smile and a rehearsed elevator pitch about the ecological importance of heritage seeds. But high society is a walled garden, and the gates were firmly locked against her. Whenever she approached a cluster of guests, the conversation would organically, almost seamlessly, shift to exclude her. They spoke of summers in Monaco, the fluctuating art market in Geneva, and the headaches of staffing their tertiary vacation homes. When Nora gently tried to steer the topic toward philanthropy and conservation, she was met with blank stares, polite nods, and swift departures. "How quaint," a silver-haired shipping magnate murmured after she finished explaining her greenhouse project. He checked his Rolex. "Well, best of luck with your gardening. If you'll excuse me, I see the senator." Left standing alone with a glass of sparkling water, Nora retreated to the perimeter of the room, finding solace near a massive, albeit gaudy, floral arrangement. She was analyzing the poorly hydrated stems of the imported lilies when the distinct click-clack of Christian Louboutin heels approached her. "Nora, I almost didn't believe it when Eleanor told me you were on the pity list." Nora turned. Zoe Montgomery stood there, flanked by 3 women who served as her perpetual echo chamber. Up close, Zoe's perfume was cloying, a heavy floral scent that masked something sharp and synthetic. "Good evening, Zoe," Nora said evenly, refusing to let her smile falter. "The gala is lovely. Eleanor has outdone herself." "Yes, she usually does for these little charity tax write-offs," Zoe drawled, her eyes raking up and down Nora's vintage dress. A small, cruel smirk played on her lips. "I see you decided to come as you are. Vintage is so brave, especially when one doesn't have a modern tailor." One of Zoe's sycophants giggled, a high, reedy sound that grated on Nora's nerves. "My grandmother had excellent taste," Nora replied calmly. "Some things don't go out of style." "Clearly," Zoe shot back. She took a sip of her champagne, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Tell me, Nora, where's your escort? Surely you didn't brave the Sinclair Gala entirely on your own. Did the local park ranger have prior engagements? Or perhaps the boy who bags your fertilizer couldn't find a tuxedo to rent?" The volume of Zoe's voice was intentionally loud. pitched to carry over the ambient hum of the string quartet. Several nearby guests turned their heads, their conversations halting as they tuned in to the unfolding drama. "I preferred to come alone," Nora said, feeling a hot flush creeping up her neck. She hated that Zoe could still provoke this physical reaction in her. "I am here on behalf of my conservatory. It's a professional obligation, not a social outing." "Oh, darling, don't try to dress it up." Eleanor Sinclair herself materialized from the crowd, seamlessly joining Zoe's circle. Eleanor was an older, polished woman, her neck heavy with an antique diamond collar. She offered Nora a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. "We all know why you're here. You're looking for handouts. It's admirable, really, your little plant project. But one must understand the rules of the room they are in. Showing up unescorted, in whatever that is." Eleanor gestured vaguely at Nora's dress. "It shows a lack of respect for the occasion. It makes you look desperate, my dear." The surrounding crowd had now formed at a loose semicircle, a silent audience to Nora's social execution. The whispers began, a low, buzzing static of judgment. "Look at her shoes. Are those scuffs? Who invited the help? I heard she lives in a shack near the wetlands. Utterly tragic to show up alone to something like this. So painfully pathetic." Nora stood frozen. The sheer, unadulterated snobbery was suffocating. She had faced down corporate lawyers and hostile zoning boards without blinking, but the psychological warfare of 100 wealthy socialites staring at her with unabashed contempt was a different kind of violence. She felt her throat tightening. The logical part of her brain screamed at her to turn around, walk out the grand doors, and drive back to the sanctuary of her greenhouse. Zoe leaned in close, dropping the pretense of polite conversation. "You don't belong here, Nora," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. "You are dirt. You play in the dirt, and you belong in the dirt. You thought you could walk in here and play pretend with us? You're a joke. Leave before you embarrass yourself further." A heavy, oppressive silence fell over Nora's immediate vicinity. The humiliation was complete. She looked down at her hands, devoid of rings, devoid of wealth, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. She took a step back, ready to concede defeat, ready to flee. Then the music stopped. It wasn't just the string quartet that ceased playing. The ambient chatter of 300 of the city's most powerful people died out like a candle snuffed by a heavy hand. Nora stopped her retreat, looking up as a collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. All eyes had snapped away from her and were now fixed securely on the grand entrance of the Sterling Manor ballroom. Standing in the arched doorway, flanked by 2 imposing security personnel, was Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Ashbourne. In a world where old money usually spoke softly, the Ashbourne name roared. The Duke was an aristocrat in the truest, most terrifying sense. He possessed a lineage that predated the nation itself, combined with a ruthless, modern business acumen that had swallowed entire corporate conglomerates whole. He owned the land Sterling Manor was built on. He owned the banks that financed Eleanor Sinclair's real estate empire. He was a phantom, notoriously reclusive, entirely uninterested in the petty social seasons of the elite. He had not attended a public gala in over 5 years. Yet here he was. Arthur Pendleton was 35, tall, with shoulders that filled out a masterfully tailored, midnight black tuxedo that made every other man in the room look as though they were wearing cheap rentals. His face was all sharp angles and aristocratic coldness, his dark eyes sweeping over the frozen crowd with an expression of profound boredom. Eleanor Sinclair nearly tripped over her own custom-made gown in her haste to greet him. The opportunity to have the Duke of Ashbourne at her gala was a social coup, that would cement her legacy for a decade. She shoved past Zoe and Nora, her face stretching into a mask of obsequious delight. "Your Grace," Eleanor breathed out, executing a dip that was halfway between a curtsy and a bow. "What an absolute unexpected honor. We are entirely humbled by your presence at Sterling Manor tonight. Please allow me to show you to the VIP." Arthur didn't even look at her. He didn't break his stride. He walked straight past the wealthy hostess, as if she were a piece of inconveniently placed furniture. The silence in the room deepened, becoming thick and electric. Zoe Montgomery, realizing the Duke was walking toward their side of the room, hastily smoothed her hair and arranged her features into a seductive, welcoming smile. She stepped forward, blocking his path just slightly, ready to introduce herself as the heiress to the Montgomery fortune. Arthur paused. He looked at Zoe. His gaze was so intensely dismissive that Zoe physically flinched, stepping back out of his way without a word. The Duke continued forward, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. He walked until he reached the towering, poorly hydrated floral arrangement. He walked until he stood exactly 2 feet away from Nora Caroline. Nora looked up at him. The panic and humiliation that had been suffocating her mere moments ago vanished, replaced by a complex, entirely different emotion. Arthur looked down at her. The icy, terrifying mask he wore for the world melted away in a fraction of a second. His dark eyes softened, tracing the lines of her face, the elegant curve of her neck, the simple silver hairpin holding back her hair. He didn't care about the hundreds of eyes watching them. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently taking hers. He lifted her knuckles to his lips and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss against her skin. "Forgive my tardiness, darling." Arthur's voice was a deep, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly in the dead silent room. He didn't shout, but he made sure every single person in a 50-foot radius heard him clearly. The international board meeting ran much later than anticipated. He stepped closer, wrapping a protective, possessive arm around her waist, pulling her against the solid wall of his chest. He turned his head, fixing a freezing, lethal glare directly on Zoe Montgomery and Eleanor Sinclair, who were both staring with mouths slightly open, their faces drained of all color. "I trust," the Duke of Ashbourne said, his voice dripping with a quiet, terrifying menace, "that those people haven't been boring my wife while I was away?" The word hung in the air, heavy and lethal as a suspended guillotine blade. Wife. The collective inhalation of 300 aristocrats created a vacuum in the grand ballroom. Glasses of champagne were lowered, forgotten. The string quartet, who had been waiting for a cue to resume playing, sat frozen with their bows hovering inches from their instruments. Eleanor Sinclair's meticulously Botoxed face contorted into an expression of sheer, unadulterated panic. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a wax figure melting under harsh lighting. Zoe Montgomery, whose entire identity was built on being the smartest, cruelest predator in the room, suddenly looked small, frail, and violently ill. "Whoa, wife," Eleanor finally managed to stammer, her voice lacking any of its former haughty resonance. She looked frantically between the imposing Duke and the woman she had just publicly degraded. "Your Grace, there must be some sort of misunderstanding. Miss Caroline she is a botanist." Arthur's gaze did not waver from Eleanor. It was a look that had paralyzed seasoned board members and driven ruthless corporate raiders to early retirement. "Her Grace," Arthur corrected, his tone deathly quiet. "The Duchess of Ashbourne is indeed a brilliant botanist, a passion I have the profound privilege of funding, and you, Mrs. Sinclair, are currently breathing her air. To understand the absolute shock radiating through Sterling Manor, one had to understand the mythos of Arthur Pendleton." For the past 3 years, the tabloids and high society matchmakers had exhausted themselves trying to pin down the elusive Duke. He was considered the ultimate unattainable prize. He never dated. He never attended galas. He operated his vast empire from behind the fortified walls of his ancestral estate or from secure penthouses in London and New York. No one knew that 3 years ago, on a torrential Tuesday evening in late October, the Duke's armored luxury sedan had blown a tire on a deserted county road adjacent to the regional wetlands. His security detail had been miles behind due to a scheduling error, and the cell service was non-existent. Arthur, soaked to the bone and irritated beyond measure, had walked toward the only source of light, a sprawling, humid glass conservatory. He had expected a caretaker. He found Nora. She had been covered in potting soil, her hair a chaotic mess, desperately trying to secure a tarp over a leaking section of the greenhouse roof. She hadn't recognized him. To her, he wasn't the billionaire Duke of Ashbourne. He was just a stranded, grumpy man, ruining a very expensive, bespoke suit in the mud. She handed him a mug of cheap instant coffee, tossed him a dry flannel shirt, and put him to work, holding the ladder while she patched the roof. For Arthur, a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by sycophants, yes-men, and women who viewed him as a walking bank vault, Nora's utter indifference to his wealth was an intoxicating shock to the system. She treated him like a human being. They sat in the humid warmth of the conservatory until dawn, talking about soil degradation, architecture, and the heavy burden of familial expectations. He returned the next day, and the next. He courted her in the quiet spaces, away from flashing cameras and prying eyes. They fell deeply, irrevocably in love over muddy hiking boots and late-night dinners in obscure diners where no one recognized him. When he proposed, beneath the sprawling canopy of a 300-year-old oak tree on her property, he offered her a choice. "My world is toxic, Nora," he had told her, holding her soil-stained hands in his. "It is entirely built on leverage, cruelty, and optics. I will not drag you into the glaring spotlight until you are absolutely ready. We can marry, and we can keep it our secret, just ours, until the time is right." Nora, who valued her peace and her conservation work above all else, had agreed. They were married in a tiny stone chapel in the Scottish Highlands, with only the local vicar and Arthur's fiercely loyal head of security as witnesses. For 3 years they lived a double life. The public saw the cold, untouchable Duke. Nora knew the devoted, fiercely protective husband who spent his weekends helping her categorize rare orchid crossbreeds. The secret was supposed to hold for another year until Nora's wetland preservation initiative received federal protection, shielding her life's work from the inevitable media circus. But Arthur had caught wind of the Sinclair Gala. He knew the vicious ecosystem of the city's elite. When Nora insisted on attending alone to secure funding, stubbornly refusing to let him anonymously donate the money because she wanted the conservatory to stand on its own merits, he had reluctantly agreed. However, he had his intelligence team monitor the event. The moment his head of security, watching via compromised catering cameras, alerted him that Zoe Montgomery and Eleanor Sinclair had cornered his wife, Arthur had authorized his pilot to break every aviation and noise ordinance to get him to the city. Now, standing in the ballroom, Arthur pulled Nora slightly closer, his thumb gently stroking the silk at her waist. The protective warmth radiating from him grounded her. The humiliation that had threatened to crush her minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, profound strength. We had no idea," Zoe whispered, taking an involuntary step back as Arthur's predatory gaze finally shifted to her. Her signature arrogance had evaporated. Your Grace, if we had known, if you had known she was a duchess, you would have offered her false smiles and hollow flattery. Arthur finished for her, his voice cutting through the silence like glass. But because you believed she was beneath you, you showed your true nature. You are exactly as pathetic as your father, Zoe. Zoe flinched as if she had been physically struck. The destruction of Eleanor Sinclair and Zoe Montgomery was not going to be a loud, screaming affair. Arthur Pendleton did not yell. He dismantled his enemies with surgical, terrifying precision. Arthur snapped his fingers, a single, sharp sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Immediately, one of the imposing security personnel stepped forward, handing the Duke a sleek, leather-bound portfolio. "Mrs. Sinclair," Arthur began, his tone almost conversational, which made it infinitely more frightening. "You pride yourself on this gala. You pride yourself on Sterling Manor. It is the bedrock of your real estate empire, is it not?" Eleanor swallowed hard, her diamond collar suddenly looking like a choke chain. It is our flagship property, Your Grace. Yes, a magnificent estate," Arthur mused, casually flipping open the portfolio. "Historically significant, architecturally sound. It's a shame about the underlying leasehold." A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the closest bystanders. Eleanor's eyes widened in sheer terror. "For those unacquainted with the finer points of commercial real estate," Arthur said, his voice carrying effortlessly, "Sterling Manor is built on land historically owned by the Crown, later transferred to a private trust, a trust which, as of 3 hours ago, was wholly acquired by Pendleton Holdings." Eleanor let out a choked gasp, a hand flying to her chest. "You see, Eleanor," Arthur continued, his eyes devoid of any mercy, "your grandfather negotiated a 99-year ground lease. That lease expires in exactly 14 days. I had intended to renew it, as a matter of routine administrative oversight. However, having witnessed your distinct lack of hospitality tonight, I have reevaluated my portfolio." Arthur closed the folder with a definitive snap. "Pendleton Holdings will not be renewing the lease on the land beneath Sterling Manor. You have exactly 14 days to vacate my property. I suggest you begin packing your chandeliers." The silence in the room was absolute. Arthur hadn't just insulted Eleanor Sinclair. He had publicly, legally, and financially eradicated her most prized asset in front of everyone she desperately wanted to impress. The Sinclair real estate empire relied heavily on the prestige of Sterling Manor. Without it, her stock would plummet before the markets opened on Monday. Eleanor's legs gave out. She collapsed into a nearby velvet armchair, her hands covering her face as a quiet, broken sob escaped her lips. None of her wealthy friends moved to comfort her. In this world, weakness was a contagion, and Arthur Pendleton had just declared Eleanor Sinclair terminally ill. Arthur then turned his attention back to Zoe Montgomery, who was currently attempting to inch her way backward toward the exit, her crimson dress catching the light. "Going somewhere, Miss Montgomery?" Arthur asked smoothly. Zoe froze. "Your Grace, I apologize unreservedly. My behavior was inexcusable. It was a lapse in judgment." "It was a reflection of character." Nora spoke up for the first time. Her voice was calm, clear, and steady. The room shifted its focus to the woman in the vintage blue dress. She didn't look like a victim anymore. Standing beside the Duke, her posture was impeccable, her chin raised. She looked exactly like a duchess. Arthur looked down at his wife, profound pride warming his dark eyes. He yielded the floor to her with a slight nod. "You tried to destroy the wetlands 3 years ago, Zoe. Not for profit, but for ego," Nora said, addressing the woman who had tormented her. "And tonight you tried to destroy my dignity for the exact same reason. You use your wealth as a weapon to make yourself feel towering, but standing here looking at you now, you just look incredibly small." Zoe opened her mouth to retort, but the instinct for self-preservation kept her silent. "Allow me to make her a bit smaller, darling," Arthur murmured, stepping forward. He looked at Zoe with absolute disgust. "Montgomery Shipping, your father's company. Your primary source of revenue is the exclusive freight contract with Pendleton International Logistics. It constitutes roughly 60% of your annual gross profit." Zoe's face turned an ashen shade of gray. "Please," she whispered, the word tearing from her throat. "I am officially terminating that contract, effective immediately, citing a breach of the morality and ethics clause," Arthur stated coldly. "My lawyers will be sending the formal notice to your father's office by dawn. Tell him his daughter's penchant for public bullying has cost him his fleet." The sheer brutality of the strike was breathtaking. In less than 5 minutes, the Duke of Ashbourne had bankrupted a socialite and severely crippled a shipping dynasty, all without raising his voice. Arthur turned his back on the devastated women, dismissing them entirely. He looked out over the sea of silent, terrified guests. "My wife," Arthur announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "is the founder of the Regional Flora Conservancy. It is a vital, noble endeavor. I am personally endowing the Conservancy with a foundational grant of $50 million. He paused, letting the astronomical number sink into the minds of the wealthy elites who had scoffed at Nora's gardening project an hour prior. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, a dangerous smile playing on his lips, "I expect that anyone in this room who wishes to maintain favorable business relations with Pendleton Holdings will find it in their hearts to generously support the Duchess's initiative. The fundraising gala is officially open." He turned to Nora, the coldness vanishing entirely as he offered her his arm. "Shall we, Your Grace? I believe there is a very expensive, very poorly hydrated floral arrangement that offends your sensibilities. Let's go fix it." Nora smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up the room. She slipped her hand through his arm. As they walked through the ballroom, the crowd scrambled, parting wildly to give them a wide berth, the guests practically tripping over themselves to bow their heads and avert their eyes. The woman who had walked into Sterling Manor as a punchline was walking out as its undisputed queen. The departure of the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne from Sterling Manor was nothing short of cinematic. As Arthur and Nora walked toward the grand double doors, the silence of the ballroom was suddenly broken by the frantic, undignified scrambling of the city's elite. The very people who had deliberately spilled their drinks to avoid standing near Nora an hour earlier were now lunging toward their phones, furiously dialing their wealth managers and public relations directors. Before Arthur's armored Bentley had even cleared the manor's wrought iron gates, the Regional Flora Conservancy's modest website crashed. The server, accustomed to perhaps a dozen visitors a week, was entirely annihilated by an influx of frantic, six-figure donations. Every CEO, hedge fund manager, and trust fund heir in the room was desperately trying to buy their way into the Duke's good graces, terrified that their mere presence in the room during Nora's humiliation would mark them as collateral damage in Arthur's impending financial war. Inside the quiet, soundproofed sanctuary of the Bentley, the ambient neon lights of the city washed over the leather interior. Nora let out a long, shuddering breath, slumping back against the seat. The adrenaline that had kept her spine straight and her voice steady was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Arthur shifted closer, slipping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her against his side. He didn't say a word, simply resting his chin on the top of her head. He knew her well enough to know she needed a moment to process the sheer velocity of the last hour. "Well," Nora finally murmured, breaking the silence. She reached up to pull the silver hairpin from her hair, letting the dark strands fall around her shoulders. I suppose the secret is officially out. The greenhouse roof will definitely get fixed now. Arthur let out a low, rumbling chuckle, pressing a kiss to her temple. I imagine you could build a greenhouse entirely out of solid diamond by tomorrow morning, considering the panic I just left in that ballroom. Are you all right, Nora? Truly. She tilted her head to look at him. His eyes, usually guarded and sharp, were entirely open, filled with a vulnerable, anxious affection. I am, she said softly, tracing the line of his jaw. I hated seeing them look at you like you were just a weapon. But I didn't hate what you did. Zoe, Eleanor, they have bullied this city for decades. You didn't just defend me, Arthur. You dismantled a regime. They forgot the cardinal rule of high society, Arthur replied, his tone darkening slightly. Never mistake a quiet entry for a lack of power. But the storm is only just beginning, my love. By tomorrow, your name will be on the front page of every major publication from London to Wall Street. You will be hunted by the paparazzi. Your past, your family, your research, they will dig into all of it. Let them, Nora said firmly, lacing her fingers through his. I have nothing to hide. My life has been dirt, seeds, and you. They can photograph the dirt all they want. She was right, but neither of them fully anticipated the sheer scale of the media explosion. By dawn, the story had broken containment. It wasn't just society gossip, it was a global financial earthquake. The Financial Times ran a headline detailing the sudden, catastrophic stock drop of Montgomery Shipping and the Sinclair Real Estate Group. Tabloids in the UK printed full-page spreads with the headline, "The Botanical Bride, Billionaire Duke Secretly Weds American Scientist." Photos from the gala, smuggled out by catering staff who had recorded the entire confrontation on their phones, went viral within hours. The internet was mesmerized by the image of the fiercely elegant woman in the vintage blue dress, standing shoulder to shoulder with the terrifying Duke of Ashbourne, as two of the most powerful women in the city wept in the background. However, cornered animals are the most dangerous. Richard Montgomery, Zoe's father, was not a man who accepted defeat. Watching his shipping empire hemorrhage billions in market value over a single weekend was unacceptable. He knew he could not attack Arthur Pendleton directly. Pendleton Holdings was an impenetrable fortress of wealth and legal firepower. If he sued for breach of contract, Arthur's lawyers would keep it tied up in litigation until the Montgomery family was living in a cardboard box. So, Richard decided to attack the Duke's only perceived vulnerability, Nora's reputation. If he could prove that the Duchess of Ashbourne was a fraud, a grifter who had manipulated a billionaire, or a corrupt scientist embezzling funds, he could force a public scandal so severe that Arthur would have to distance himself, perhaps even nullify the marriage. It was a desperate, malicious gamble. On Tuesday morning, Richard Montgomery made a very quiet, very lucrative phone call to Dr. Harrison Gable. Gable was a former state environmental regulator turned private consultant, a man widely known in agricultural circles for rubber-stamping destructive corporate projects in exchange for heavy consulting fees. He was exactly the kind of mercenary Richard needed. Within 48 hours, Gable had manufactured a meticulously fabricated 80-page dossier. The document alleged that the Regional Flora Conservancy was a front for money laundering, claiming that Nora had been illegally importing invasive, unregulated plant species to artificially inflate her conservation metrics and secure federal grants. It was a highly technical, jargon-filled assassination of her life's work. Gable leaked the dossier directly to a sympathetic, sensationalist news network. On Thursday morning, just as Nora was finally finding a moment of peace to water her endangered orchids, her phone rang. It was Arthur's head of public relations, sounding distinctly panicked. "Your Grace, the the PR director said, his voice tight. "Turn on Channel 4, right now." Nora walked into the small break room of the conservatory and clicked on the television. There, sitting at a polished news desk, was Dr. Harrison Gable, looking appropriately grave. "It is with a heavy heart that I bring these findings to light," Gable was saying, looking directly into the camera. "Miss Caroline, or I should say, the Duchess, has positioned herself as a savior of our local ecology. But my independent audit reveals gross negligence, misappropriation of federal funds, and the illegal smuggling of hazardous flora. It is a biological threat masquerading as a charity." Nora stared at the screen, the watering can slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the linoleum floor. The sheer audacity of the lie left Nora temporarily breathless. Embezzlement? Smuggling. Every penny she had ever secured had been stretched to the absolute breaking point just to keep the greenhouse heated during the winter. Every seed logged was heavily documented by federal agricultural standards. Her phone vibrated again. It was Arthur. "I've seen it." Arthur's voice was a low, terrifying growl. It was the voice of a man ready to burn a city to the ground. "Ian, do not move from the conservatory, Nora. My security team is locking down the perimeter. The paparazzi are already swarming the access roads. I have my legal team drafting a defamation suit so massive it will bankrupt Gable by lunchtime." "Arthur, wait," Nora said, her scientific mind rapidly compartmentalizing the panic, overriding it with cold, hard logic. "A lawsuit will take months, and in the court of public opinion it will just look like the billionaire Duke is using his endless wallet to silence a whistleblower. It plays right into Montgomery's hands." "I am not going to let them drag your name through the mud," Arthur countered fiercely. "I work in the mud, Arthur," Nora replied, her voice steadying, an edge of pure steel creeping into her tone. "They attacked my science. They attacked my conservatory. I'm not hiding behind your lawyers for this. I'm going to gut him with my own scalpel." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Arthur finally spoke, the anger had receded, replaced by a deep, resonant pride. "What do you need?" "I need your PR director to invite every single press outlet currently outside the gates to come inside," Nora commanded, her eyes scanning the massive, ceiling-high filing cabinets in her office. "And I need your forensic accountants. Gable is sloppy. If Richard Montgomery paid him to falsify an 80-page biological audit in 3 days, there's a paper trail. Find it." 2 hours later, the sprawling, humid central atrium of the Regional Flora Conservancy was packed to the brim with journalists, cameramen, and local news anchors. They had expected a tearful, panicked Duchess hiding behind a wall of corporate security. Instead, they got Nora Caroline in her element. She wasn't wearing vintage silk or diamonds. She was wearing her heavy denim work apron over a simple white button-down, her hair tied back in a practical braid. She stood at the head of a long wooden potting table, which was now entirely covered in thick, meticulously organized binders, ledger books, and framed federal compliance certificates. Standing quietly in the shadows near the back of the atrium was Arthur. He had specifically requested his security detail to remain out of sight. He wasn't there to rescue her. He was there to watch her reign. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Nora began, projecting her voice over the whir of camera lenses and the hum of the climate control system. She didn't use a microphone. "Earlier today, Dr. Harrison Gable released a dossier accusing this conservancy of ecological terrorism and financial fraud. I am here to address these claims." A reporter from a major network thrust a recorder forward. "Your Grace, Dr. Gable alleges you imported illegal invasive species from South America to fake your biodiversity metrics. How do you respond?" Nora offered a cold, razor-sharp smile. She opened the first binder on the table. Dr. Gable's report, specifically page 42, cites the presence of eichhornia crass IPs, in our wetland restoration tanks. He claims this is a smuggled, hazardous asset. She turned the binder around so the cameras could zoom in on the highlighted text. What Dr. Gable, a man whose doctorate is in political administration, not botany, by the way, failed to realize is that the photograph in his own dossier is not Eichhornia crassipes. It is Pontidaria cordata, pickerel weed, a native highly beneficial species that we have been cultivating under a direct grant from the Department of the Interior. Here is the DNA sequencing report from the State University confirming its identity, and here is the federal grant ledger. She slapped 3 separate, heavily stamped documents onto the table. The journalists frantically scribbled notes. Furthermore, Nora continued, her pace relentless, moving down the table. He claims we have a $70,000 deficit in our operating budget, implying embezzlement. If Dr. Gable had bothered to check the publicly available county tax records, which are right here, he would see that this deficit was actually a private, heavily taxed land purchase. We bought the 80 acres of threatened marshland directly adjacent to us to prevent Montgomery shipping from illegally dumping ballast water into the ecosystem. The mention of Montgomery shipping sent a shockwave through the press corps. The connections were instantly clicking into place in the minds of the reporters. Let's speak about Dr. Gable's credibility, Nora said, pulling a sleek, black tablet from beneath her apron. This was the ammunition Arthur's team had provided just 15 minutes prior. My husband's forensic accounting firm conducted a brief inquiry into Dr. Gable's private consultancy firm this morning. Yesterday, an offshore shell corporation named Crimson Tide Holdings wired $400,000 into Gable's Cayman Islands account. The silence in the greenhouse was absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic dripping of the irrigation system. A 2-minute search of international corporate registries reveals that Crimson Tide Holdings is a subsidiary of Montgomery International, Nora stated, locking eyes with the camera broadcasting live to millions. Richard Montgomery, enraged that my husband canceled his freight contracts due to his daughter's abhorrent behavior at the Sinclair Gala, paid a disgraced regulator nearly $500,000 to frame me for a federal crime. Chaos erupted. Reporters were shouting questions all at once. Camera flashes strobe lighting the humid air. Nora held up a hand and the sheer authority in her posture silenced them. The Regional Flora Conservancy is an open book. You are free to review these ledgers. You are free to photograph our tanks. But understand this, Nora's voice dropped, ringing with an unyielding, fierce determination. I am not a socialite playing in the dirt. I am a scientist. This land, these plants, are my life's work. Anyone who attempts to destroy this sanctuary to settle a bruised ego will find that I do not wilt under pressure. I take root. She stepped back from the table. This press conference is concluded. My legal representation will be submitting this evidence to the federal authorities for Dr. Gable's immediate indictment for fraud and Mr. Montgomery's indictment for corporate extortion. As the journalists scrambled to rush their footage to their producers, Nora turned and walked toward the back of the atrium. Arthur stepped out of the shadows, his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. He didn't care about the remaining cameras. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of rain, damp earth, and orchids. Remind me, Arthur murmured, his voice thick with emotion, never to cross you, Her Grace. You are the most terrifying, magnificent creature I have ever witnessed. Nora laughed, wrapping her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. I told you, Arthur. I know how to handle weeds. You just have to pull them out by the roots. The internet operates at the speed of light. But the federal government, when handed a silver platter of irrefutable corporate fraud, moves with the crushing, inescapable weight of a freight train. Within 48 hours of Nora's master class in crisis management, the video, dubbed by the media as the Botanical Takedown, had amassed over 80 million views. It was broadcasted on every major financial and news network across the globe. But more importantly, the forensic accounting trail exposed by Arthur's team had reached the desks of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. On Monday morning, precisely at 8 a.m., a fleet of black, unmarked SUVs pulled up to the glass-fronted headquarters of Montgomery International in the financial district. Special Agent Thomas Reardon, accompanied by a dozen federal investigators holding thick, sealed warrants, bypassed the frantic receptionist and marched directly into the executive elevators. Richard Montgomery was sitting in his corner office, furiously screaming into a phone at his crisis management team when the heavy oak doors swung open. He dropped the receiver, the color draining from his face as Agent Reardon presented a warrant for the seizure of all physical and digital records relating to Crimson Tide Holdings. The panic within the company was instantaneous. By noon, the board of directors had convened an emergency, closed-door meeting. They did not invite Richard. By 2 p.m., a press release was issued. Richard Montgomery had been ousted as CEO, stripped of his voting shares, and the company was cooperating fully with federal authorities. It was a desperate attempt to save the shipping empire from total annihilation, but the damage was terminal. The stock, already bleeding from the loss of the Pendleton contracts, entered a free fall, triggering automatic trading halts on the exchange. For Zoe Montgomery, the realization of her family's destruction did not arrive with a dramatic arrest, but with a quiet, humiliating click. She was at an exclusive, appointment-only boutique in the city's upper echelon, attempting to purchase a $40,000 diamond necklace to soothe her frazzled nerves. She handed the associate her black titanium credit card with her usual haughty indifference. The associate swiped it. The machine blinked red. Declined. There must be a mistake, Zoe snapped, her heart rate spiking. Run it again. The associate, a woman Zoe had belittled on several occasions for her choice of footwear, offered a thin, polite smile. I'm sorry, Miss Montgomery. The issuer has frozen the account. All of your accounts, it seems. I'm afraid I cannot process this transaction. Zoe snatched the card back, her face burning. She practically ran out of the boutique, dialing her father's private number. It went straight to a sterile automated voicemail. Frantic, she opened her contacts and called Eleanor Sinclair, seeking refuge, seeking an ally in a world that was suddenly tilting off its axis. The phone rang 4 times before Eleanor picked up. Eleanor, thank God, Zoe breathed, pacing the pavement. My cards are frozen. My father isn't answering. It's an absolute nightmare. I need to come over to Sterling Manor. There was a long, cold silence on the other end of the line. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was entirely devoid of the warmth they had shared just a week prior. Sterling Manor is currently being packed into moving crates, Zoe, Eleanor said, her tone brittle and hollow. Because of your little stunt, my family is losing our flagship estate. My investors are pulling out. I am liquidating assets just to keep the commercial firm afloat. Eleanor, please, we are in this together. We are not in anything together, Eleanor cut her off sharply. You are radioactive, Zoe. Arthur Pendleton is systematically dismantling anyone who stood near you that night. Do not call this number again. The line went dead. Zoe stood alone on the bustling, expensive street, the realization crashing over her like freezing water. She had spent her entire life cultivating fear and enforcing exclusivity, believing that wealth made her invincible. Now the wealth was gone, and the fear had turned inward. Without her money, she had no friends. She had no power. She was entirely, terrifyingly alone. Meanwhile, Arthur's lead counsel, the notoriously ruthless Gregory Harrington, was systematically tightening the noose. Harrington didn't just hand the evidence to the feds. He filed a sweeping civil defamation and damages lawsuit against Dr. Harrison Gable, that was so mathematically devastating, it made the man weep in his attorney's office. Within 3 days, Gable broke. Terrified of spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, Gable signed a comprehensive plea agreement, handing over every email, every recorded phone call, and every encrypted text message proving that Richard Montgomery had explicitly directed and funded the smear campaign against Nora. The trap had snapped shut. The predators had become the prey, caught in a snare of their own arrogant design. 6 months later, the biting winds of autumn had once again descended upon the sprawling metropolis, but the landscape of the city's elite had been irrevocably and violently altered. The dust had finally settled from the seismic shockwave of the Sinclair Gala, leaving a vastly different world in its wake. The indomitable Richard Montgomery, a man who had previously commanded international boardrooms with the casual cruelty of a feudal lord, was a ghost of his former self. He had not gone down fighting in a blaze of legal glory. Arthur's lawyers had ensured the evidence was so suffocatingly absolute that Montgomery's own defense team advised him to surrender. He had pled guilty to 3 federal counts of corporate extortion, wire fraud, and bribery. Now, he sat under indefinite house arrest in a sprawling, heavily mortgaged suburban estate that he could no longer afford to heat properly. Montgomery Shipping, the crown jewel of his family's dynasty for 3 generations, had been aggressively acquired and dismantled by a foreign conglomerate for pennies on the dollar. The Montgomery name, once a passport to any VIP room in the world, was now synonymous with corporate disgrace. Zoe Montgomery's descent into obscurity was perhaps even more poetic. Stripped of her trust fund, her titanium credit cards, and the sycophantic friends who vanished the moment her bank accounts were frozen, she had fled the city in the dead of night. She now resided in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a dreary suburb of Omaha, Nebraska, living under her mother's maiden name. The woman who had worn custom Parisian couture and mocked a duchess for wearing vintage silk now spent her days wearing a stiff polyester uniform, working as an entry-level customer service representative for a regional insurance firm. Every time a frustrated caller yelled at her over a denied claim, Zoe was forced to swallow her pride, apologize, and type their complaints into a slow, outdated computer, a daily, grinding punishment for a lifetime of unearned arrogance. Eleanor Sinclair had technically survived the fallout, but her survival was a hollow victory. Stripped of the Sterling Manor lease and bleeding investors who were terrified of Arthur Pendleton's wrath, the Sinclair Real Estate Group had been forced to liquidate 70% of its assets. Eleanor now operated out of a generic, leased office space in a mid-tier commercial district. She spent her mornings aggressively cold-calling clients who used to beg for her attention, surrounded by the haunting memories of a social empire that had crumbled to dust in a single evening. And Sterling Manor, the grand, imposing estate that had served as the ultimate fortress of high society exclusion, stood entirely transformed. On a crisp, brilliantly sunny Tuesday morning, Nora stood in the sprawling gravel driveway of the estate. She was not wearing a vintage silk gown or the heavy crown of societal expectations. Instead, she wore a comfortable pair of tailored wool trousers, a thick cashmere sweater, and her signature sensible leather boots. Arthur stood beside her, looking effortlessly imposing in a dark overcoat, the wind ruffling his dark hair. He was watching his wife with that same quiet, profound adoration he had shown her since the rainy night they first met in a leaking greenhouse. "Are you ready, Your Grace?" Arthur asked, a playful, knowing smile touching his lips as he looked up at the towering, historic facade. Nora let out a breath she felt she had been holding for months. "It still feels entirely surreal, Arthur. This building, The very stone of it used to represent everything I despised about this city. The exclusion, the arrogance, the suffocating vanity of it all. Which is exactly why we aren't going to live in it. Arthur replied softly. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a heavy, antique brass key, placing it gently into the palm of her hand. He folded her fingers over it. It doesn't belong to the elite anymore. It belongs to the soil. Months ago, the moment Eleanor Sinclair's 99-year lease had officially expired, Arthur had his legal team execute a masterstroke. He formally transferred the deed of the land and the manor itself out of the lucrative portfolio of Pendleton Holdings and directly into an irrevocable trust, a trust owned entirely, permanently, and exclusively by the Regional Flora Conservancy. Nora pushed open the heavy, carved oak doors. The grand foyer, once a suffocating chamber of expensive perfumes and judgmental whispers, had been entirely gutted. The massive, ostentatious crystal chandeliers had been carefully uninstalled and auctioned off, replaced by state-of-the-art, full-spectrum, industrial grow lights. The pristine marble floors, which guests had once been terrified of scuffing, had been reinforced and overlaid with specialized, heavy-duty drainage grating. They walked hand in hand into the grand ballroom, the exact room where Nora had stood entirely alone, mocked and humiliated by a circle of predators. It was utterly unrecognizable. The towering exterior walls of the ballroom had been opened up, reinforced with sleek steel beams, and seamlessly integrated with 3 massive cutting-edge glass conservatories that spilled out onto the estate's sprawling back lawns. The room was breathing, it was alive. Towering prehistoric ferns, incredibly rare Amazonian orchids, and critically endangered native saplings thrived in the temperature-controlled environment. The air smelled of rich loam, fresh rain, and blooming jasmine. A dedicated team of 30 botanists, environmental researchers, and university students milled about in white lab coats and soil-stained denim aprons, analyzing water filtration samples and meticulously logging genetic seed data. The estate had been reborn as the Caroline Pendleton Botanical Institute. It was no longer a guarded fortress for the wealthy. It was a sanctuary for the earth, a living library of biodiversity. Arthur had spared absolutely no expense, funding the radical transformation with the $50 million he had publicly promised on the night of the gala, plus a massive, quiet endowment that ensured the institute would operate freely without relying on federal grants or private donors for the next century. The mayor's office called my chief of staff again this morning, Arthur noted, his voice a warm rumble as they walked through a grove of restored, weeping willows planted directly into what used to be the formal, raised dining room. They are practically begging us to host a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The entire city council, the governor, they all want a photo opportunity with the philanthropic duchess who single-handedly took down the Montgomery Empire. Nora laughed, the sound bright, clear, and unburdened, echoing beautifully through the dense canopy of leaves. Absolutely not. No galas, no exclusive VIP guest lists, no color-coded name badges. The Institute opens to the public this weekend, free of charge for anyone who wants to walk through the doors and learn about wetland preservation. If the mayor wants a photograph, he can put on a pair of rubber boots, come on a Saturday morning, and help the local middle school students repot the pickerel weed. Arthur stopped walking. He pulled her gently by the waist, turning her until she was flush against him. The warm, humid, life-giving air of the greenhouse surrounded them, providing a stark, comforting contrast to the cold autumn wind blowing outside the thick glass walls. "You took a symbol of absolute vanity," Arthur murmured, looking around at the vibrant, thriving ecosystem that now occupied the cold, hollow halls of Sterling Manor. And you turned it into pure life. You conquered them, Nora, not with their weapons of cruelty and gossip, but with growth. Nora looked up into her husband's dark, intense eyes. She reached up, resting a palm against the sharp angle of his jaw, grounding herself in his solid presence. She thought back to that terrible, freezing night, to the suffocating feeling of being surrounded by wolves in crimson dresses, and to the breathtaking moment the heavy doors swung open and her quiet, fiercely protective husband stepped through the crowd to shield her from the venom. "I didn't conquer them alone," Nora said softly, her thumb brushing over his cheekbone. "I just planted the seeds. You provided the heavy machinery to clear out the dead wood." Arthur smiled, a genuine expression of profound happiness that few people in the world ever got to see. He lounged down, pressing a deep, lingering kiss to her lips. It was a silent promise, a permanent seal on the life they had built together in the quiet shadows, which was now blooming brilliantly in the open light. They didn't need the hollow validation of high society, and they certainly didn't need the applause of a ballroom filled with strangers. They had their sanctuary, they had their life's work, and above all, they had each other. The simple woman in the vintage blue dress had not just inherited a meaningless, aristocratic title. She had rewritten the entire moral landscape of the city. Nora Caroline proved once and for all that true power doesn't scream for attention from the center of a crowded, glittering room. True power takes root in the dirt, survives the harshest, coldest winters, and eventually, beautifully, overgrows the stone castles of those who arrogantly believed they were untouchable. What a journey from the agonizing depths of public humiliation to the ultimate brilliant triumph. Also, Nora Caroline showed us that you don't need to change who you are to fight back against the cruelest bullies. You just need to stand firm in your truth. She weaponized her intellect, her integrity, and her unyielding passion for the earth to completely dismantle an arrogant empire, proving that true nobility is defined by character, not a bank account. And with a fiercely protective Duke of Ashbourne by her side, they transformed a fortress of exclusion into a thriving sanctuary for all. If you love this story of satisfying justice, profound love, and the ultimate botanical revenge, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life dramas and empowering stories. Stay strong and keep growing.